Welcome to Behind the Pages. Becky Thompson is with us today. Becky is professor and chair of the sociology department at Simmons College. She is an activist, she's a poet, she's also a yoga instructor, and she's here today to talk about Survivors on the Mat. This is a book about the personal testimony from a number of people, including Becky, who are survivors of childhood trauma and abuse, who talk about the healing power of yoga and how it has helped them to live more empowered lives. Welcome, Becky.
Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about the book? How did you organize the book?
I started the book through a series of 2 to 3 page meditations or musings, I think, with the idea that a lot of people don't have much time to read books in their entirety anymore, and I wanted a way for people to be able to dip in and dip out of a book. And I also, this is a form that's different than any of the other books that I've written because it allows people to take their time with a book. Because it's a book about trauma and healing, I wanted it to be accessible and also friendly, so that people would be able to carry it with them and dip in and dip out depending on where they were in their days, whether they were picking up their kids or they were waiting for the bus, and so that it would be a kind of companion. So it's about 90 different 2 to 3 page stories that include a whole range of people from Native American and African American and Caribbean and Trinidadian and from Thailand and Vietnamese, and I wanted to get a whole range of people's voices to help us understand yoga's roots, which have always been quite wide-ranging, and also to get a sense of the range of traumas that people come to the mat working their way through.
And what about the research on this subject?
I had done a number of books on trauma before coming to this book, and I'm using trauma in the big sense of the word. I'm talking about individual traumas caused by car accidents or from an illness, but also the big traumas that are caused from the Holocaust or from slavery or from genocide or from incarceration, from racism, from poverty. And so my work over the years has been on how we can make sense out of traumas, whether it be from Hurricane Katrina or 9/11 or the Abu Ghraib prison terrorism, and to look at how people cope when they're up against the unnameable or the unspeakable, as Toni Morrison would talk about it. So this book came out of the various different books I had done before about social justice and the ways in which people respond to trauma by becoming activists. So it made a lot of sense to take that framework and then look at how people are dealing with, in creative ways, with their own traumas and their miraculous and amazing ingenious forms of healing.
And including how yoga has played a part in that.
Yeah, so my focus on yoga in part was because when I got to the yoga mat, I came as someone who'd been an athlete. I'd played rugby and I'd rode on a crew team and I'd been a long distance runner, but someone brought me to a yoga class in my late 30s, and I didn't really know why I was there, but I started to understand that there were some reasons that I didn't understand, that there was the inexplicable going on. So I would be at the end of a yoga class and would be sobbing my eyes out and not understand why. Or I would go into Ustrasana, which is camel, which is a big back bend, and find myself crying. And so I realized that there were issues, as my good friend Nikki Myers says, there were issues living in my tissues that I hadn't been able to really touch in talk therapy and in other ways that I'd been healing, and that yoga was going to enable me, hopefully, to start to get to some of those issues as well. And then along the way, I started to realize that I really wasn't alone in terms of coming to the mat as a way to try to heal. But there wasn't a lot of language among the people I was connected with about what that healing looked like. It was as if people were doing the healing silently, but not necessarily sharing it. There was a kind of shyness and embarrassment, a fear to talk about yoga as something other than a physical practice.
Right. And there actually is scientific research that has shown that it helps in both physical healing and emotional healing, isn't there?
Well, that's some of the beauty of the work that's been coming out in the last 20 and 30 years, is that the scientific work is now helping us have specific quantifiable data for what yogis have known for thousands of years. And there's this beautiful synergism that's happening now, that's in large part because of what the Dalai Lama has done. The Dalai Lama was someone who was so interested in how the brain and the mind works, and to help neuroscientists understand that. So he allowed his own deep knowledge of meditation to be up for scientific investigation, and he opened the way for us to start to understand so much of what's going on in the central nervous system and in the brain that yogis had known for a long time.
You became aware of the need to write a book like this at a point, I think you said, in a teacher training course. Can you tell us about that?
My first teacher training was in Colorado. It was a yogi training, and it wasn't to become a teacher, but it was just to deepen my my own practice. And then I did a training, a 200-hour training here in Boston, and it's was offered by this really extraordinary teacher. But in the process of doing the training on a Sunday morning, when I was in pigeon, which is where you're on your stomach with your knee bent on your inside, we were doing assists, and there was someone pushing on my hips as I was lying down, face down, and I dissociated on the mat. And dissociation it's as if a part of you is no longer there. And in my case, I felt like I was a pumpkin that had been thrown against the wall and had come down in all kinds of different pieces. And having dissociated before, I knew that what I needed to do was get out of the room and to find some support. And thankfully, one of the people in the training came out with me and sat with me as I kind of brought myself back into some place of safety and security. And then I went back into the training and realized that I was afraid to tell people what had happened. And then it started to occur to me that there were other people who'd been talking in the training about their own depression or their anxiety or their addictions or their own struggles with food, but that they hadn't been saying that in the training. They had been saying that around the edges, outside, and during meals. And then I started to understand, wait a minute, this isn't just in this class, this isn't just this training, that there's actually this huge split. It's like trauma was here, and yoga's here, and social justice is here, but in my mind they all connected with each other. So what do we need to do to bring those three together? And so I found my hand kind of going up and spontaneously asking if I could co-lead a session on trauma and healing, and the lead instructor, of course, welcomed that. And so that was the beginning. So then I started to do some more reading, and I wanted an accessible and intimate and honest, funny and supportive book that would include stories of a real range of people, so that everybody could see themselves somewhere in the book. But there wasn't such a thing. And that's when the stories started coming out of my body.
Now, how do you connect up with it? I mean, because yoga workshops are often not specifically targeted for victims of trauma. I mean, they may just be a general yoga workshop. So how do you find people, or do they find you? Do you recognize something in the other person?
Well, that's the thing about divine intervention, right? That we're often guided in ways that we have no idea about, that there's more going on in this universe than we have conscious or rational access to. But I certainly feel as if as soon as I started to write my own story, that people presented themselves to me. And then along the way, I also read much more and found individual stories. So for example, there's a world-renowned yoga teacher who has written briefly about how when she was in high school, she found herself making a decision between staying addicted to heroin or starting to do yoga. And at that point, there was this juncture in her life where she ended up deciding to go the way of yoga, that yoga helped her free her from her heroin addiction, among a number of other things. So I started to find people's little stories written in little like short stories, and then I started to do more like conversations with people, kind of putting the word out about that I was interested in getting people's stories. And I teach yoga in the summers at a feminist Buddhist retreat center in Thailand, and the people I work with are activists who are coming to the center for rejuvenation and regeneration, and they include people who work with LGBT community, or they grew up in the refugee camps in the border of Thailand and Burma, and or one of my closest people is a nun who's in her 70s now, who has always worked in Sri Lanka. And so along the way, there were just people whose stories they were very gracious about telling me. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. You know, there are a lot of different types of yoga. What have you practiced yourself, and how do you advise other people when they say, okay, I'm interested in trying this, but I don't know where to start?
That's a fabulous question, because I think it can be really scary to go to yoga. There's all these preconceived notions about what yoga is and what goes on in the rooms, and there's also such a variety of yoga now that people can think, well, how do I even know where to start? And I think that finding the right yoga is a little bit like getting the right pair of shoes. You know, you go into a shoe store, you try this on, you try that on, this works, this doesn't work, and then at some point you say, this feels just right. So it's like trying to find a shoe that feels like an Ugg, or that feels like slippers, right? And I think that's what sometimes it takes with yoga, is finding someone who's really skilled, someone who sees you, who remembers your name, who makes room for all different kinds of bodies. I think these are some of the clues that it's a place that's safe for healing. In my own case, because I started as an athlete, I wanted a yoga class that I thought would be intense physically. And so I started with Bikram yoga, and really that still is my home practice, which is very surprising for people to learn, because the yoga that I teach is not at all like Bikram, although of course I've been deeply influenced by it. And what I appreciated about Bikram is that it's 26 postures done twice, exactly the same postures every single time, and 2 breathing exercises. And so I knew exactly what I was walking into. And there's something quite comforting about having the postures be exactly the same, since our own atmosphere psychically and emotionally and spiritually is so changed. So I can always kind of get a sense where I am in relation to something that's very stable.
Right, so you could go to Boston or Los Angeles or Portland, Oregon, and basically do the same 26 postures.
Yes. But yoga is really on the end of the continuum of a very, very physical practice. It's very hot, it's very physical, it's very intense, right? And I think for other people, something that's much quieter and much more deliberately spiritual and much that isn't hot can work really well. And for me, what's happened is I describe myself as a yoga polygamist. You know, I really sleep around. I go to several different studios over time, and thankfully the different studios are quite, accepting of that. So alongside doing the Bikram yoga, I started doing salsa and merengue and bachata and ballroom dancing and improv, contact improv, and I wanted to see how I could bring the yoga into dance. And then I started to, in my teaching, a lot of what I try to do in my teaching is help to find ways to multiply joy. Because one of the things that happens with trauma survivors, whether that's having been in Iraq or that's having been imprisoned or whether that's experiencing gang violence or sexual abuse, is a restriction on play space, a narrowing down of what we consider play. So I try in my own yoga classes to make there be space for play. And one of the ways that I do that is by having a playlist of music that I love, that I hope resonates with other people, but also incorporating dance. So I take the asana and I turn it into choreographed dance that we all do together. And so, for example, there was a Survivors Theater Project, which is this extraordinary grassroots organization in Boston that has an annual event and around the holidays. And they asked me to come, and we were able to have like 100 people get up together. Only 3 people stayed down. 100 people got up, and we all did this yoga dance together to one of Patti LaBelle's songs. So anyway, so that's the long answer to the variety of yoga that I think is available, and how with trauma survivors, we may start one place, and then we may move to another kind of yoga at a different time, and something that doesn't appear to be spiritual, like a Ashtanga class or a Bikram class, it actually ends up bringing you to that deeper, more spiritual place, kind of by definition, just because you're working so deeply with your body.
Sure, right. Well, when you first started yoga yourself, did you know you were there to heal emotionally?
Not at all. And I don't think I'm alone in that. There's a woman I've been working with for 4 years. I teach at the Dorchester YMCA, and she was so beautiful. After Survivors on the Yoga Mat came out, she wrote me this email, and she said, you had no idea. And she's a very able-bodied woman in her 20s who can do every pose. I never thought she was having any struggle. She says, you have no idea what shape I was in when I started emotionally. She said, I was just torn up. And she never even told me that she came to yoga with this sense of really wanting to save her own life. And it wasn't until the book came out and I've often been struck by the people who've been through the most are often the ones that I don't have really, they're not very explicit with me at all about what they're struggling with, which is some of why I don't teach courses that are, or classes that are specifically trauma-based necessarily, because I assume a lot of people come in with having a trauma history, and sometimes the ones who have the most layers of trauma are the ones that have the least words for it. So I just try to make the space available for everybody, kind of whether they have their stories together or not.
Right. Yeah, because might it even happen that some people don't even realize that they are victims?
Yes. And I think for me the emphasis is to help people find that what was victimization can turn to a whole other place, and that a lot of us, just as you were saying earlier about how do we find each other, I think trauma survivors have a kind of sixth sense. We have almost like a subculture. We have ways of being with each other. We tend to support the underdog. We tend to be very alert about what's going on around us. We have, we're very perceptive. We tend to be hard on ourselves. We tend to have great determination and a willingness to tell the truth and to break rules because the rules were already like broken for us. And so I think there's ways that we find each other and in that way can support each other through the process without necessarily even naming the specifics.
Right, and I think that must be very helpful to people, because sometimes you don't necessarily want to put things into words anymore. I mean, I would think that there is a point in time when you want to work through the effects the trauma has had on you without words, and I think yoga does give you that opportunity.
And the endorphins kick in. So you can go in feeling depressed and upset and tired, and you go out you know, an hour and a half later, and it's not as if all those issues have gone away.
No.
But something has gone on with the alignment in the body, because the body has these domes starting from the foot going all the way up to the crown chakra, right, that can get into alignment. And that brings a sense of peace. And then the relaxation that can come from just getting the anxiety out of your body, sweating it out of you. And then also the quiet that can come. And for a lot of trauma survivors, there are 3 things that have been disrupted. One is at the level of the body, and that can actually mean having ignored the body or being afraid of the body or not actually being inside of the body. And another is at the level of the mind, the tricks that the mind plays with memory when it's so hard to access some of what's gone on. And then there's the level of the spirit. And what yoga does is help you find alignment between the mind and the body and the spirit, again, to bring back into some kind of integrity what has often been split apart.
Can you tell us a little bit about your own childhood? I mean, you talk about it in the book, so are you comfortable doing that?
Yeah, so I was raised by a very courageous single mom, not all of my childhood, but a lot of my childhood, who was a teen mom, who put herself through college and waitressed with 2 little ones to support, and a father who I adored, but who was also a drunk, and my mother ended up taking us away from him when I was pretty little. And then he came back, and I think one of the earliest traumas for me was he was trying to stop drinking, and he took Antabuse, that is a pill that can supposedly help you to not drink again, because if you drink again you can get really sick. Well, he took the Antabuse and then got horribly sick and just wanted to die. And I watched him as a 3-year-old as he was pulling the IV lines out of his arms, screaming to the emergency medical technicians that he wanted to die while they were strapping him to this gurney. And you can just imagine for a big seeing, vulnerable little girl to watch your daddy in that situation and to hear that what he wanted to do was die. And then for him to really disappear from my life soon after that. So that's, I think, one piece. But there was also other early trauma that was pre-verbal, which means for a lot of us, we don't necessarily have all the specifics. We can have the physical information, but not the emotional, or we have the emotional, but not the scene. And then that's also very tricky. I remember talking to a psychiatrist once who was doing a talk at a professional conference, and again, my hand found its way up, raising the question, like, why is it that when I talk about the trauma that I've experienced, the very next sentence, what I want to tell you is that I'm lying? Because that's still my experience when I talk about trauma, is that I want to say, and I'm lying. And he said that's part of the trauma. It's like the denial is right there alongside of the reality of it. And that's especially true when it's pre-verbal, because we don't have enough, quote, evidence. So that, I think, alongside a lot of alcoholism in my family and a lot of moves, many, many different moves, and incest that occurred also when I was in my early teens, and physical violence led up to, by the time I was in high school, feeling quite disconnected from my body, although I would have never been able to say those words because I thought that was normal. I didn't know what it meant to live inside of the body. It's taken me a long time to know what that experience is like. And that's, I think, a good thing for trauma survivors to know. You know, we don't really know what we're missing if we've never had it.
And at the time, you probably didn't really even know what was normal.
No. No. And I was, like a lot of trauma survivors, I was ambitious and running fast and succeeding in the world and getting a lot of...
So you didn't have a period of time where you were on drugs, for instance, or had developed something that would be apparent to somebody else?
No, I did develop an addiction related to food, and I ended up writing a book about it, which was enormously helpful for me as well. It's called A Hunger So Wide and So Deep, and it's a multiracial history of anorexia and bulimia and compulsive eating. And that book really came out of my own experience of using food as a way to cope with a number of different traumas. In that book, I was trying hard to depathologize eating problems and talk about them as a way of making a way out of no way and sane solutions to insane situations. And that's not so different than what I'm talking about in Survivors on the Yoga Mat, is that that many trauma survivors have been taught that there's something wrong with us, but actually we have a number of capacities, and we've done a lot of things in this life to try to survive and that need to be recognized, at least by ourselves, as we did the best that we could in that situation. So I don't think people saw on the outside what I was struggling with, which in some ways made it harder for me, because I looked like I had everything together, and that also makes me have my eyes open now for people who I see around me who are really excelling, but inside are really struggling to be able to stay in the world as whole people.
Yeah, and I think it's hard too for people to, when the world sees them as hyper competent, to give that up, to say, you know, there's actually a backstory to that.
Yes. Yeah. You know, we all have backstories. So really some of it is, how do we make spaces available where we can be honest with each other? And I think about, you know, like the first time I met you, and, you know, the beautiful parties that you that you throw, and the way that you make your home available and so hospitable to such a range of people. You know, you got firemen there, and you got like lawyers there, and you got people working security, and you got people who are staying home with their kids, and you got, you know, little kids, and I think that's some of what we're called to do in the world, is make a space to be real and authentic and genuine with each other, so that we don't have to have superficial conversations, so we can feel safe to say what's really going on in our lives. And certainly there have been some yoga teachers over the years who have made that possible for me, who have really looked at me as a person and noticed when I was crying, and held me and laughed with me, and, you know, encouraged me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that, you know, with yoga, you know, that's the beauty of the other forms. There may be a time when you need a particular form of yoga, and there may be a time when you need another more meditative, or, you know, some other form. And yoga is so varied. How does meditation fit in? Is that considered a part of yoga, or is that something different?
Well, actually, the yoga that we think about now in the last 100 years is a remarkable deviation from the 2,500 or 3,000 years of yoga before, which was primarily meditation. It had very little to do with asana. If you did an asana, if you did a posture, it was to do that so that you could get comfortable sitting. So what we've seen in the last 100 and some odd years is this move to increase the use of asana. And that has its pros and its cons, because I think people can go to yoga for many years and never know that meditation is a key piece of it. That I talk about Shavasana, which is the end when we're lying down on your back, as the most important posture of the whole thing.
Because you've worked the whole class to get to that.
Exactly, that's it. And so sometimes when I hear yoga teachers say, well, you can stay for this Shavasana or not, you know, I'm thinking, well, stay. Just stay, because
it's
that's
important
when you might actually experience the stillness.
Absolutely. Well, I would like to continue talking with you, but we are out of time.
Thank you.
You have been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian. That was great. I, you know, really feel like, oh, did 29 minutes really just go by, you know? So.